Good evening, viewers, and welcome to One Exclusive. Water, electricity, housing, railways, telecommunications. These are pillar industries for our national survival, and traditionally we rely on the state to render these services. The state does so through state-owned enterprises. In most African countries, the private sectors are small and businesses are involved in commerce, not production. Utilities like water, energy, postal services and railways are complex commodities that need high infrastructural investment and regulation. This makes these industries unattractive to local investors. To deal with economies of scale, African states created state-owned enterprises or merely inherited them from former colonial administrations. State-owned enterprises, or SOEs, are meant to further socio-economic development by providing physical infrastructure and regulation. SOEs should create stability through regulating industries and buffering the effects of an unstable global economy. However, in Namibia, as in the rest of Africa, these enterprises have been burdened by corruption, mismanagement and negligible governance. The media has slated state-owned enterprises for their lack of service delivery and their constant drain on state coffers. What is the current state of affairs of Namibia state-owned enterprises? And what is the future role of parastatals in an ever-tumultuous global economic environment? Tonight we speak to Honourable Minister Jooste from the Ministry of Public Enterprises to find out how they are trying to ensure, as far as possible, that SOEs are contributing to our national development goals. With us in studio is Honourable Minister Jooste from the Ministry of Public Enterprises. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Jan.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Thanks for joining us in studio.
Pleasure.
Now, we've inherited the government at independence, about 12 parastatals. There were over 50,000 civil servants. It was very fragmented according to ethnic lines. And since then, the picture's changed a lot. There are a lot of new players, a lot of new state-owned enterprises. But there's more than just employment creation that these enterprises fulfill as a role. Can you tell us what are the roles of SOEs in our country at the moment?
Okay. So typically, in Namibia being a developing economy, and it's a global phenomenon, one would find more state-owned enterprises, public enterprises, than you would in a developed economy. So in our case, we have a number of service providers. Our regulators are also regarded as public enterprises. Then we have a number of commercial public enterprises, as you know, also providing services essentially. We have a number of what we call extra budgetary funds, like the Namibian Students Fund, the Environmental Investment Fund, and so in our case, a really wide portfolio of public enterprises.
Now, tell us, let's just quickly touch upon that, the idea that they're not all economically viable, that they're not all commercial institutions. And tell us a bit about the roles there, because I mean, obviously stuff like water infrastructure is already a naturally monopolized industry and not something that the private sector can essentially afford to, play a role in. So tell us, what really is the role of these enterprises?
That's really the crux of public enterprises all over. And it brings us to the question of why public enterprises, essentially. And in most cases, it should be services or functions that the private sector cannot perform. Hence, the state has to perform those. And normally, the most efficient and effective way to do those are through public enterprises. So when we talk about commercial or economic viability, then obviously we tend to refer to the commercial public enterprises, the businesses. And even there, you mentioned something like NAM Water, NAM Power, being utilities. We need to be very careful in the case of public enterprises to push too hard for high profit margins. And why? Obviously, because that would mean that they would have to tax or put a burden on the consumer at the end of the day, and that being a bulk or the individual consumer, and that may once again be to the detriment of the economy and the consumer. So yes, commercial enterprises need to be commercially viable, but not necessarily at the same margins as your private sector companies would be.
All right. And then let's just look at the Namibian landscape, the differences between those who are commercially viable. I think at the moment there are only a handful that really do make a lot of money. Those would be the banks, telecommunications, for instance, postal services. And these are somehow happens where there's already a monopoly over the industry. Aside from these 4 or 5, what type of SOEs are there that we don't know about?
Yeah. So in our case, well, they're all important. Of course, the profile changes. In our case, the University of Namibia, University of Science and Technology, they also qualify as public enterprises. So we regard those as public enterprises as well. In our case also, we should never underestimate the role of our regulators, which is hugely important. They're also public enterprises. But the main problem I know we've been experiencing in Namibia are with the larger commercial public enterprises, the businesses, the ones that have cost the big money and have been a big burden on the national budget. And those are usually your larger commercial public enterprises.
So just for the clarity of our viewer, where does the government decide that this is now going to become a commercial entity? Where does it start making money or start profiting? How do you make that distinction?
So I think a good example would be the difference between NamWater and NamPower in Namibia. NamWater and water is a very complex commodity globally. Globally, a number of countries have tried to commercialize water provision, bulk water provision, and it's failed in most cases. So in Namibia, no different. NamWater is working purely on a cost recovery basis. So there is no intention for the entity to generate any sort of a profit. Whereas NamPower is something completely different. They are profit driven. They need a certain buffer to be able to upgrade equipment and roll out energy distribution to various parts of the country. So a typical difference that you would find between those two entities, and you tend to have more of those all over. Over time, we foresee, obviously, as the economy develops, that many of these sectors will open up, become more liberalized and become more attractive to the private sector to participate.
And this is how the government then buffers that process?
Yes, it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So again, we need to be realistic. NamPower need to generate a profit for our energy security, but we need to control that. So they should not have a too high of a profit margin. Once again, that will be to the detriment of the consumers.
Thank you very much. Viewers, after the break, we will look a little bit deeper into SOEs. This year's budget has made it clear that government has to cut on spending. Government has budgeted for expenses of up to 66 billion Namibian dollars. The state, however, expects an income of only 59 billion Namibian dollars, 45% of which comes from the taxpayer's pocket. A large chunk of our spending is dedicated to the development budget and infrastructure development crucial for sustainable economic growth. However, over 20%, that's 12 billion Namibian dollars of our state income, is spent on bailing out struggling SOEs. Despite these enterprises having important social functions, most of the resources seem to go to waste. The inflated public wage bill being an even greater point of concern. SOEs are plagued by corruption and mismanagement. What causes this relentless fiscal failure, and how do we address it? I think media is fraught with, corruption trials, inflated salaries for management, top management, and things like that. What are really the problems, governance-wise, with SOEs? What are we facing?
And interesting, once again, very important that I say this and not being protective. It's not unique to Namibia. So We've been doing a lot of benchmarking to other very highly developed, mature economies, and even in their cases, SOEs are still challenging. SOEs have some unique attributes to them. They're not normal, even the businesses are not normal businesses, so to speak. But in our case, yes, we have been poor as far as governance is concerned. In the past, I think before the existence of the ministry, we have been, and even still now, we have been trying to govern SOEs in flawed governance models. Currently, we are still in what is called a dual governance model, where our ministry share the responsibilities with various line ministries, and it's not an ideal model. These models have not worked in any other country. So going forward with reforms, we will be migrating towards a more centralized model. So giving a dedicated ministry more authority to ensure that proper corporate governance principles are adhered to, and equally important, if they are not adhered to, there will be consequences as well. But it boils down to corporate governance and a failure of corporate governance.
Honourable Minister, let's talk privatization. A lot of people see that the only way to save struggling SOEs is to privatize, to make them publicly listed, or then in our case, what we've been doing more and more is to outsource work to private sector. Let's talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of things like this.
Yeah, I think we need to, once again, terminology. The ministry is going to look at all of these options, definitely. Again, privatization can be in various forms. One of the options would be, in some cases, we foresee an attractive opportunity for strategic partnerships. So typically, a strategic partner would invest in a company, and based on the investment they've made and to protect the investment, add management and skills capacity usually. So definitely some opportunity for that. We have a good reference of how well that's worked in Namibia, being MTC, our mobile operator, which through its strategic partner, especially in the initial stages, has been a large part of its recipe for success. So that is one. Another one which we have been speaking about is potential listing of public enterprises on the stock exchange, which we are very excited about, seeing that as a huge opportunity for the public.
Right, and I think there are some people who have a problem with government interference, the fact that their performance isn't incentivized. Yes. Some people say that the structure, inhibits innovation and creativeness, and that ownership is lacking with, service delivery, for instance. Yes. What would you say about that?
I have to agree with those. So we have not, and I need to say that, so as a shareholder, speaking on behalf of government as a shareholder, we've also not been a professional shareholder. And all of this is changing. For instance, you mentioned incentives. We will have new remuneration guidelines, which will be issued very shortly, together with performance agreements. So a completely incentivized remuneration system and performance management system in public enterprises. So a complete shift from what we currently have, a complete lack of performance management. Okay. We have some agreements. Less than 20% of public enterprises have performance agreements in place, although it's required by law. So we are changing that, but it's also no point having performance agreements if there isn't performance evaluation. Definitely. So the ministry will be undertaking a large project.
Definitely, and now moving on again to privatization. I know, for instance, the trade unions would be very upset with, a big privatization movement. And people also saying that, it might neglect our black economic empowerment drive if we privatize to such a large scale. Do you think that these fears are substantial?
I don't think so. I think once again, and the public and the unions and everybody who has that concern should be reminded that the shareholder in this case is the government. The government being the custodian of all of these laws and policies you just referred to. So I think it should be very obvious that we would not allow for something like that to take place, which may be in conflict with existing policies and legislation. So definitely I have no fear over that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So, short-term plans for your ministry. You've got quite a lot ahead of you. Tell me, what are we looking forward to in the next few months?
So very soon, of course, things have to go through all the cabinet processes, etc. We will be amending our legislation again. We're in a very dynamic period where for the next year, 2, 3, we will be introducing a number of reforms for public enterprises. So we need to get used to that. So some further legal amendments required. And then the most important thing, a new governance model. And the new governance model will form the basis of all future SOE reforms. So a very exciting period. So very soon, this year, a lot of things will be happening, which I can't tell you too much about. But we are excited and very confident. It's not going to be easy, but we know where we're going. So people must bear with us, be patient. We're following a particular sequence of events. So I know the public tends to be a bit impatient when it comes to these reforms. Yeah. So and unfortunately we have to follow the sequence. So
right. Honourable Minister, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Lovely.
Viewers, that is all from us this evening. If you have any comments about tonight's topic, SMS us at 555.